beginning time. I'd like to thank everyone for coming into our class 990, the politics of the 2020 U.S. Census. Do you really count? Uh, I'd like to mention also that we are duly broadcasting this over YouTube Live, so you can find the channel on OLLI's channel, find it being broadcast at this point. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to our Executive Director, Jennifer Desano. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at George Mason University. And as Mike said, today you will be enjoying a presentation on the politics of the 2020 U.S. Census. Do you really count is the theme. And this will be presented by Dr. Helen Desfosses. She's a professor emerita in public affairs and policy from the State University of New York at Albany. She has a BA in Russian language and literature from Mount Holyoke College and an MA in Soviet studies from Harvard and a PhD in political science from the Boston University African Studies Center. She was president of the Albany, New York City Council for 2 four-year terms, and she's the author of many books and articles on contemporary politics. She's been a frequent lecturer in public policy at OLLI for the past several years, and we're very grateful for her for making time to offer us this fabulous presentation. Please welcome Dr. Helen Desfosses.
Thank you very, very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. This is my first time being at an OLLI class with this new technology, with Zoom. I know a lot of you are probably very familiar with it by now. I think more of my life is on Zoom now than is in real life now. But I'm trying to catch up and modulate myself when that's appropriate, and speak louder when it's not appropriate. So I'm here today to talk about the politics of the 2020 U.S. Census. You'll see right on the screen the slides that we prepared, conflicts and controversies. You know, when you're an academic, you have to have a title that has a colon in it, and then after the colon, it has 3 words. That's what we've learned how to do in graduate school, and we continue to do to this day. So, Mike, that's good. What is a census? We're going to talk about some very, very basic things here, and also basically about how the census reflects not only the demographics of the time of a particular country, but also the politics of the time. What issues are important? What points of view are important? In fact, the president was on television at 11 o'clock this morning on Channel 4 News, talking about the census and talking about how he hoped that undocumented immigrants would not be counted. So he's telling us the way he told us on his first speech when he announced he was running for office, that immigration is very, very important to him. This is one of his most seminal issues, one of his most reflective issues. And he's telling us it's important to him, and he wants to make sure at all times that that issue of immigration, who's in the country legally, who's not in the country legally, is being addressed in every possible way. So a census is a counting, as you know, of all of the people in the country at a given year, given period. Every 10 years, the Constitution of the United States says that we will take a census every 10 years. So 2020 is one of those census political years. Now, a census is a very loaded document because it reflects, first of all, the politics and policy that are surrounding that process. The ones that are in the air, the ones that national parties are enshrining at their conventions as very important, the ones that are being written about on the front page of the newspaper, the ones that are being spoken about. It's like almost a litmus test, almost a reflection of what we're seeing in the ether, in the political ether of political concepts. That's what is going to be reflected in the census. Now, what happens in the census, we've taken it every 10 years since 1790. So you can imagine what the experts know about the population of the United States. It is illegal for any information that is taken in by a census taker to be shared with anyone in an individual way. So your information is sacred as far as the federal government is concerned, and there are grave penalties for them not abiding by that particular level of care. So a lot of people have a concern about privacy. I don't want to answer the census because I'm not sure they're going to respect the privacy of my information. And it turns out that there are a lot of factors promoting respect of your privacy, and a lot of penalties for not doing that. So by and large, I've never seen any evidence that this was a violative thing. Every 10 years, the census is taken. There are 500,000 people involved in taking it, which I find absolutely astounding. The United States has about 338 million people, and it takes 550,000 people to keep track of us every 10 years, to make notes of who we are and where we are, and whether we live in with other people, other family members, and what size is our house and whatever. Every 10 years, over 500 million people, 500,000 people are needed to take count of 338 million Americans at this time. And we need more people and we need more money every time because the census is becoming more and more complex. On the one hand, and Michael Emery was saying this before we got started a few minutes ago, on the one hand, you can now respond to the census online, which is a very, very new thing. We used to have a long form or a short form, depending on which one you got in the mail. And you rolled up your sleeves if you got a long form and made a big sigh because you knew this was going to take you quite a while to answer. Now, basically, everybody gets the same census. It's about only 5 or 6 questions. Where do you live? You know, how many other people are living in this house? Are they related to you, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a snapshot at a particular moment in time of the United States of America. Now, the census got delayed this year. As you might imagine, everything got delayed this year because of the virus, because of the exigencies of this health emergency, of this public health emergency that we're in, and the efforts of our political system and our sociological and medical systems to deal with this emergency that we're facing. So we have a lot of implications of that. And one of the problems of the census and its efforts to count everybody is that, first of all, a major problem then becomes undercounting. How many people get undercounted? How many groups, how many minority groups are undercounted? Why are they undercounted? Are they undercounted because of some deliberate process that they're always suspicious of? Are they undercounted because another ethnic group might be in charge of that particular counting mechanism? Basically, we rely on a variety of activists to come forward at census time on behalf of the activity groups or the minority groups, in quotes, that they represent. So there are disabled activists that come forward. The Disabled Activists of Chicago is a very well organized group. And they want to make sure that every single one of their people, their members, are counted. And they want to make sure they're counted because political resources, government resources, money, where hospitals are going to be built, depend on who shows up in the census. So I noticed, I used to live in Albany, New York, the capital of the state of New York. And over time, the fortunes of the capital city of New York have been reflected in its status in the census. They've lost many, many, many seats over time. There are only 435 seats in the United States Congress and another 100 in the Senate. So those 435 seats are divided up according to the proportion of the US population that your state, your locality, your county, or your group represents. So the state of New York, which used to be, as you know, it's still called the Empire State. Every once in a while, you still see a license plate on the city streets here in Alexandria or in Richmond, wherever. Empire State, an orange, old orange license plate. And you know, its stature was sacrosanct. Everybody knew that the Empire State, the state of New York, was one of the most populous states in the country, was one of the richest states in the country, was one of the most influential states in the country. And over time, there has been a real loss of seats belonging to New York because of the United States Census, because New York proportionally has not been growing as fast as a lot of those states that are out in the Midwest, and basically the far West is where most of the growth is occurring. And all of that growth is a zero-sum game at census time. 435 seats in the Congress, that number is not going to increase. What is going to change is how that 435 number is divvied up among 50 states. If your state is growing in population, you'll get more seats. And if your state is losing population, there will be a decline in the number of seats that you have. It's all picture the governor being almost a military person, and at census time, the epaulets are just ripped off his or her uniform if there hasn't been a growth in the population of his or her state. And that's what happens at census time in figurative terms. When you show up, there's no way of arguing that number isn't accurate. In fact, the only way you can argue is that you can say you've been undercounted, but you can't say you've been overcounted. It's really almost impossible, I think, to overcount some people. But so you have a very obvious shortcoming at census time if your population isn't growing. Everybody knows that. And then a lot of dominoes start to fall over, because if you have to lose congressional seats, right, that means they're going to be taken away from you, obviously, and given to another state that's growing. And increasingly over the last couple of decades in particular, the East Coast has by and large lost a lot of population, therefore lost some seats in the United States Congress, because they went to the Arizonas, they went to the Floridas, they went to the places where there were population booms. So it's a feedback loop that if one side is winning, the other side is losing. It's a zero-sum game. You can't, not everybody can win, because especially in terms of the number of congressional seats, it's a fixed number. So when I said the politics of the 2020 US Census, do you really count? Do you really count is kind of a double entendre, if you would. Do you really count? Do you know how to count in a difficult political time? How many followers you have, or how many members are in your group? And do you really count? Do you matter? Does your state matter still? Are you considered one of those up and coming states, not because you say you are, but because those census numbers still reflect that? So the census is a matter of a politically very crucial operation conducted by the United States government every 10 years. And it's mandated in the US Constitution that a census will be taken every 10 years. So it's a highly necessary and highly political document. It's the basis for critical political decisions being made about how many seats you're going to get. It's also highly political in the sense of, what is your share? What is your state's share of financial resources going to be from the federal government? How much money are you going to get for schools, for hospitals, for roads, for all of the goods and services that the federal government provides? And this gives you then more stature, if you would, to hopefully grow for the next 10 years. So it's always a process with momentum, with losers, with winners, but it's always active and always fascinating. Population policy is what governments do to respond to this. I mean, governments are not standing idly by. They think, okay, if the population size is so important, how are we in our administration, be it in the state, in the county or whatever, how are we going to grow then? How are we going to persuade people to come to our county, to come to our state, particularly young people of childbearing age? How are we going to persuade them to come and have more children so that we can garner a bigger share of those votes in the House of Representatives? My family on my mother's side comes from Lebanon. And Lebanon has not had a census for many, many years because the last time they had a census, it was a newly formed country coming out of World War II. And it enshrined the concept that Christians were the most numerous proportion of the population and Muslims were of secondary nature and size. Well, over time, of course, that has not proven to be true. Right now, I mean, Muslims far outnumber Christians in Lebanon, but another census has not been taken because what would we do? What would the people of Lebanon do with those results? It would probably turn the actual political process and the constitutional way that the Constitution's been written, just turn it upside down as people try to reflect a Christian minority rather than a Christian majority. So people don't even want to touch the idea, the problem of a census. In Russia, what used to be called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, they wanted their people to have more children if they were Slavic peoples, if they were the peoples of the Western parts, the developed parts of the former Soviet Union. They did not want their Muslim populations to be having more children. But what was happening all the while that the people in the Kremlin were fulminating about what they wanted to have happen is that Muslim populations were having more children. And the women who worked full time in Russia and say Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, etc., they were only having maybe 2 children, but usually not even 2 children, because there weren't enough apartments, there weren't enough consumer goods to make that an appealing idea. So all the time the Soviet Union was trying to do 2 things at once, 2 contrary things at once, with its population policy, which would then be reflected in the next census. They wanted to persuade Muslim women to have less children, and at the same time they wanted Slavic women to have more children. And this was at the same time in the country's history, although in different parts of the country and with different religions. So you can see that this is a very difficult and very sensitive arrangement here for what time the census is going to be held in your population's history and how that size reflection is going to show up in the way that the next census is treated. So it's a matter, a census is a very complex operation. As I said, 550,000 people to undertake the census. It's a massive operation. It has to be done in a very concise period of time. Typically, the census would be wrapping up right now in the United States. But they were on TV today at noontime, the Census Bureau officials explaining that because of the virus, because they can't go door to door the way they used to go door to door and remind people, hello, we're from the Census Bureau, we didn't get your form. Now, can you imagine the fear that might strike in somebody's heart? Hello, we're from the United States Census Bureau, we didn't get your form. So this time, because of the virus, they're reluctant to go door to door, and people are reluctant to open the door in and of itself. So the census is a highly political document. It's essential for the management of a society in terms of what is going to be the allocation of goods and services. But then the results of that census become an input into the census for the next 10 years. So it's always moving. If you had a job in the United States Census Bureau, you'd be always, I think, holding your head in your hands, thinking about how, whoa, we're just We just got through one census, and already we're behind on the next one, right? It's 2020. We're approaching the middle of 2020. They should already be en route to the next census. They should be getting questions straightened out and computer resources allocated and everything. And meanwhile, they're bogged down with all the things that are bothering and troubling our society at this particular time. So when I think back, when did I first hear about the existence of a census? When did that first strike my consciousness? I think it was in either Sunday school or school when they talked about maybe the reading of the New Testament, for example, where a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole world should be enrolled or counted. So all went to be enrolled, each to his own town. And Joseph too went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, and to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. So that was the first awareness that I had of the importance of a census, of the crisis that it could create for a family unit, or more usually for a political unit, and the inexorable movement of the census from one period to the next period. I mean, you're always finishing up one, starting the next one. The stakes are so high because the goods and services to be allocated are so multiple. All the goods and services in the country are dependent upon at least one numerical calculation about how they should be allocated among different size populations. Maybe that numerical calculation then gets changed a little bit, clouded a little bit with political values, but the first cut at it is a arithmetic one, is a numerical one. And so there are a lot of supporters and opponents of the census. And they make their views very clear. Now, one of the big fights in recent years was whether the census was going to allow sampling. Now, that's a very interesting concept, right? Sampling, you take a few people from a particular category and they represent the category itself in your calculations, in your formulas. Well, some people are very suspicious of that. Wait a minute now, the census says that you're supposed to count everybody. I'm not sure this sampling business really takes care of that. And there was incredible argumentation around this issue of whether sampling was going to be viewed as appropriate and as sufficient in terms of meeting the constitutional requirements of counting the people in the United States. The census is the only way we have of counting every living person in the United States. That's what we have to do every 10 years. We have to count them. And it's the only document that we have that allows us to do that, that allows us in more ways than one, that allows us not only in legitimacy terms, like who are you to say I should open the door and tell you who lives here, but allows us in the sense of the technology available and of the reach available of the census system. The US Bureau of the Census has been at this, as I said, since 1790. And this year they were very, very pleased that they could offer so many online opportunities to complete the census, and that it would take only 10 or 11 minutes to do it. And on TV at lunchtime today, they had some women who were at various public events around the capital region here, making sure that people got counted. They had clipboards. You have to have a clipboard if you're going to be in the Census Bureau. And they were helping to encourage people to fill out the forms, to sit down and do it with a portable computer right on the spot. But as the technology has made the census reach easier, then you can involve in a public way more and more people. Now, I mentioned here on the screen the problem of rumors in a social media world. As you all know, probably better than I, because there's so many of these shows on TV that keep track of various rumors and humors. that are out there, that in this country where we have so many people and so many people who have access to technology, that there are always rumors out there, sometimes aggravated, sometimes escalated by one side or the other, by one politician or the other. But there's always meat for someone's battles that are going on out there. And the problem of rumors, right? If you just say, okay, it's every 10 years now, it's time for the census, and people begin to say, well, wait a minute, how do we know what you're going to do with the data? Well, we've always obeyed the federal law. We've always just counted them. We haven't shared any of your data personally. Well, how do we know you won't do it? I understand that members of my ethnic group, for example, let's just say I was an immigrant who had just moved to this country, were maybe harassed. Maybe they didn't feel comfortable with the census person that came to the door. How do I know what happened to their data? How do I know how this data might have been used against my entire ethnic group? So because social media are so important now, anybody can basically operate the equivalent of a radio station. That's basically what's happened. I mean, I have a brand new iMac here in my own little house. The screen is almost as big as I am, and I have printers. I have all kinds of things. I mean, I could be putting out a newspaper. I could be starting a radio station. I have some incredible audio technology here and whatever. And so social media, as you know, from watching TV, from keeping track of newspapers and various brochures and posters that are around, they matter more and more because people have easy access to social media. Sometimes they feel that it's more reliable than the government itself. And it's that tension now that we see between people's trust in social media, which is sometimes stronger and more intense than their trust in the federal government. In fact, sometimes their trust in the federal government is in decline. And what happens with the census is that at any given time, right, you're either coming into an election period or you're going out of an election period. 2020, what's happening in 2020? There's a presidential election coming up on November 3rd. So all of these factors, the rumors, the future of the census, whatever, all of those factors are swirling around because people are aware that those numbers are going to be used by political candidates either for or against their candidates, for or against the principles that they're espousing. Today at lunchtime, as I said, big item on the news, various senators, Rand Paul was fulminating against the use of data. He felt it wasn't fair, it wasn't objective by the federal government. Other politicians were waiting to get to the microphone to make a contrary set of statements. And so you had the beginning of another conflict, of another set of opposition and support positions by a activist group, by an ethnic group. So social media matter increasingly because they're impossible to control. I mean, nobody can tell me what to do with my little operation here. If I had headsets and whatever, I could look like I was running my own radio station. And many people out there in America are running the equivalent of their own radio station nowadays, publishing their own newspapers, the equivalent of their own newspapers. So it's very hard for people to control what's out there and how it's being used. So the future of the census, I think that the census will go on every 10 years. I mean, it would be very, very difficult for a president to say, I'm going to put a stop to this. You know, there's too much of the weight of the United States Constitution behind the census, too much of the practice and tradition of the United States of America behind the idea that every 10 years we will have a census. So the future of the census is guaranteed, I feel, by its presence in the Constitution. and by the fact that there's a history of this having actually occurred 10 years after 10 years after 10 years since 1790. But the fact that we even have to talk about it means that in this political environment that we're in right now, traditions don't really count for everything. They used to count for a lot more. If there was a tradition, it was more sacrosanct than it's viewed as today. Now, if it's a tradition, maybe it's up for grabs. You know, maybe you could influence the interpretation of that. Maybe you could eliminate it altogether so that it wasn't such a marching theme for bureaucrats in the United States government. So there's a lot of forces out there that would like to diminish the role of the census because they want to undercount certain ethnic groups or certain minority groups. For example, the disabled population of the United States. They would like to be counted, make sure that they're counted accurately in order to make sure that their share, political concept, share of the resources of the United States is what they feel an accurate one and doesn't reflect the fact that the number of disabled people in the United States is growing or not growing. Just before I came on today, onto my radio station, there was an argument on TV between two senators about which age group was more salient to the idea of growing the population. And did you have to make sure that young people were counted, absolutely counted, in every single possible place you could find them because of their implication of their size and their number for the future of the United States? If we are a growing country, if we are a country with more and more young people not only bring tremendous resources to the United States government because they have a job, they have a new career, presumably, they pay taxes, they're bringing resources into the country, but they also have an enormous say because they're an incredible drain on all those resources. All those children, hooray, they're being born. It's called pronatalism. Most governments in the world want to raise the size of their population, particularly now. Zero population growth, that theme of the 70s and 80s, that's gone now. That's not a big United States theme anymore. What's really a big theme is don't undercount us. Count us fairly. We want to be counted like any other group. We want our share of the resources. In fact, if we could get a little higher share than our share, we'd be very happy with that. The future of America is spectacular. The future of America is more challenged than it has ever been because we have all of this agitation in our country at this particular time. And because every agitator has a bully pulpit available. You can go out and stand on any street corner in most cities. Black Lives Matter Square, you can stand out there and you can make a speech and you can get an audience and you can get maybe, unfortunately, some counter protests going. But there's cameras everywhere looking for audiences and looking for spectacular items to display. And I think America is going to be a stronger country for it all, but it's a country that's going through an incredible set of changes. And the changes are going to be reflected in the census, and a census that's taken every 10 years, and that God willing, as they say in Arabic, inshallah, God willing, it will continue to be taken every 10 years. It's the most complex operation probably that we have in this country. It's well funded, but it's in that the people who are running the census never feel that they have enough money. They would like to have more to make sure they find everybody. When I lived in Albany, New York, there was an assemblyman, and somehow he got the job as a member of the state legislature of making sure that the census counted every person they could possibly find in Albany, New York, the capital. Now, they couldn't have put a better person in charge than this guy, because this guy was young and he was hungry and he wanted political power and he wanted to make a name for himself. And he was out in the parks He was out on the streets of Albany night after night after night, not just during the day, not just knocking on the doors of apartment houses, but night after night looking for people, homeless people, people who maybe didn't want to go home. They wanted to, they were runaways or whatever. And he was very involved on behalf of the census in counting every single person in the city of Albany. And frankly, I don't think we've ever been counted as well as we were in that particular year. So we've got a lot of activism out there in America. We've got a lot of incredible energy in America. We've got a lot of groups who are advocating on behalf of certain interests and a lot of groups who are opposing those same interests. And may it ever be thus. Thank you very much. So that's the end of my formal presentation. And I think what we can do now is we can turn it over to all of you. There are 120 or so people who are watching and listening in today. And I'd be happy to get into a discussion among and between all of us. So let's see who would like to ask the first question. And our very able and very incredibly technologically apt Michael Emery will be managing that question and answer period in terms of process. Michael?
Yes, ma'am. There are a number of questions in the Q&A and or comments. First one from Shelley Gersten states, as the Constitution specifies counting persons, is it legal to omit undocumented immigrants?
Well, that's exactly what the president was talking about today. He was arguing, as I understood it, and frankly, I was just running by the living room and the television was on. And it sounded like he was saying that legally, he does not have to count undocumented aliens. That's not his job. And as far as he was concerned, those were not real Americans. Those are not real people that have to be counted. And the newsman broke it off at that particular time. So again, we have a theme that was important to this president from the first day that he was nominated to run for president. I remember I was in my car coming up I-95 to Alexandria, and I was listening. He was making his acceptance speech, and I thought, oh, great. I didn't know much about him. I thought he's going to say that all the people that he's known his entire life, he wants them to be joined by new people coming into his life. But that wasn't the message he wanted to portray. The message that he wanted to give that day was, I have my followers, I have the people who are my supporters, and those are the people whose needs and interests I'm going to respond to. So it's a political choice. When you're in politics, every time you come in front of a microphone, you have a big choice to make. You can set the world on fire, literally sometimes, or you can try to bring groups together. You can try to magnify the differences between and among ethnic groups in the United States, or you can try to find similarities on which people can build bigger and bigger sensitivities. But each politician has a choice, and our president has been making many of them, and he intends to make them right up until November 3rd, the day of the election, and thereafter, he hopes. Thank you for the question.
Carol Listecki writes, no question, just a comment that census info can be released after 72 years.
That's true. When I read that, I thought, let's see now. How many years would I mean, I'm not going to be around for the release of most of this stuff, right? But I was heartened by that. I thought, well, if I was a graduate student and I was working on a census type topic, maybe I would find that very encouraging. And people do, and I want to be serious about that. When a new set of data becomes available, that is so exciting. It's so exciting when you can get your hands on some new data. And you can be one of the first people, or maybe even the 91st people, to analyze those data and to bring them to the attention of policymakers, and maybe to catapult yourself into a political career. This is a wonderful opportunity, and go for it, is what I say.
Arthur Lerner writes, Article 1 seems to vest in Congress the power and authority to conduct a census every 10 years. Yet the Bureau of the Census is an executive branch agency. May the president direct the census not to count undocumented residents? And how are they supposed to determine who is documented?
You know, that's an excellent question. And what was happening today was another discussion between the president and the Congress around whether a question about citizenship could be added to the census. President Trump has wanted to ask a question about citizenship of every person in America who filled out a census. And there was incredible, what they call nowadays, incredible pushback. People felt that that was not right, that that was not a proper and traditional use of the census, and the question is not on there. But the president today at lunchtime on the news was still irritated by that and talking about different ways he was going to phrase the question the next time the census is run. Now, let's see, he will not be the president, however, the next time that happens. But he could be the president, gets the question out there politically and ratified politically, if you would, waiting for the census of 2030. I think he has a plan.
Okay. Dan Grove writes about the population shift you mentioned. Since the first U.S. Census in 1790, the United States Census Bureau has been recording the mean center of population as it moved steadily west and south. The first centroid town recorded was Chestertown, Maryland, and the projected centroid of the 2020 census is Hartville, Missouri. Just a comment.
Wow. Yeah. Let me just say something about that too, Mike. And I think that's a great comment to make. Is that the great migration of the 20th century in the United States, right, was from the south up to the north. Hundreds of thousands of blacks coming up from southern states to northern states, making their lives and staking out their fortune in federal government employment, in capitalism on Wall Street and various sorts. Now what's happening is a reverse migration, actually. A lot of black people are moving out of the cities of the north. It's too cold here. It's too poor here. It's too hassling here. It's too much difficulty here. There's too many still raw conflicts in the politics of a lot of northern cities. We want out. We're going back down south. So that's a reverse migration, which is carrying a great deal of fascination with it among young people in this country. Where will they go once they graduate from college? Well, maybe they won't all go to Boston and New York. Maybe they'll go to Atlanta, and maybe they'll go to Tallahassee, maybe they'll go to Joplin, Missouri, or whatever. Whole new sets of opportunities, but also it has this reverse migration has a grip on the American imagination right now, such that a lot of writers are writing about not the trip north, but the trip back south.
Okay, Susan Van Hemel asks, do you think there will be a systematic undercounting of undocumented residents in the 2020 census?
Oh boy, systematic implies that it's active, that it's deliberate. I think that there may be the result may be a systematic undercounting, but I don't think it's going to be because it's been as deliberate as people think it is. When you're feeling oppressed in a country, when you're feeling like maybe you're not welcome in the society, and there's a Black Lives Matter, this whole movement now, has put that whole issue of the value of Black life and the value of a Black education, the value of the prospects for that young person or older person, so much in perspective. I think we're going to live through some pretty complicated politics in the next 5 or 10 years, and they're going to have an enormous impact on the census.
The Barbara and Lee Killen ask, how does Trump's recent appointment of political people to the leadership of the census agency, and then question mark. And then additionally, how much room is there for mischief and game playing by the politicians is there?
You know, I love the OLLI students, right? That's why I keep coming back semester after semester, because they're so well educated. Most Americans would not know that this was going on. They wouldn't know that there was a recent, if you put, assignment by the president of two very up and coming young men, young white men, I think they were, both young men, white men, to the management and the top management of the Census Bureau. So these people sort of came in laterally, if you would. You know, they were plucked by the president from some other arena of life and said, okay, we're going to put them in the census because they must need people after all. Look at all the money that they're spending. And then of course, the newspapers began to go crazy, right? I mean, the policy-oriented newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, saying, what are you doing? You're packing the Census Administration with cronies. What's going to happen to the validity of the census if people think that the top leadership of this organization was appointed for political reasons? So a lot of suspicion has been visited, if you would, upon the Census Bureau and the census because of the taking by President Trump of these two, in this case, two up-and-coming young guys and giving them positions of incredible authority in the Census Bureau. So stay tuned would be my answer.
Jay Caputo asks, are there 550,000 census personnel full-time from one census to another census?
No. But thank you for that question, sir. Some of them are full-time, but some of them are hired as what's called enumerators. People enumerate, right? People who will count, who will be part of the counting process every 10 years. And there's an incredible process that goes on. The census, I read that they walk I don't know how many years go by when they have to do this again. But if they live in an underdeveloped area, the Census Bureau sends people out to walk that area. First of all, to understand where the roads and alleyways are, where there might be people living. Are there people living there? Have they been counted? Have they been included? If not, why not? And let's remedy it for the next census. This is, as I said, you know, an endless process. And there's a lot of that, almost adventurousness, if you would, by younger people who get involved in the census. And when there are 500,000 of them who are involved in either the research for the census, walking door to door, the going to your door because you did not return your census form, and making sure that you're responding. I mean, that's an incredible operation, and it really says we're here to stay. We're here as a bureau that's here to stay.
Okay. Ed Rader writes, do you know how or even if they count American citizens living abroad?
You know, I'm afraid I don't know that. Does somebody out there listening know that? I don't really know. I could find out though, and I will let Mike know, and then we'll try to get the information back to that person, because it's an excellent question.
Now, Noah Engelberg writes, please provide examples of how census results are used to allocate funding.
Yeah. Mainly in a proportionality sense. You know, for example, New York State, as I said, used to be one of the highest population states in the United States. And its population over time was growing. Hence the name Empire State, right? The canals that were built in upstate New York, the throughways, the freeways, everything was move, develop. That's not happening now as much in New York because our population growth rate has been outpaced by the population growth rate of other states. And therefore, that fixed amount of resources that are available to be allocated among 50 states are not going in such great proportionality to New York. They're going to Arizona, they're going to Wyoming, they're going to some of the Nevada, some of the faster growing states in the Southwest and the West, and they're not coming here. So it's kind of you know, it reminds you, if you're a faded lady kind of thing, the tired theater section of an old city, it kind of reminds you that, I'm sorry, but your day in the sun has gone, and it may come back someday, but for this census, for the next census probably, and the one after that, you're not going to be one of the prize recipients of a lot of resources because you're just not growing. You're not growing. That becomes the big mantra.
Barbara Schoenfeld writes, given the census does not collect information on legal versus non-legal residency, how can Trump remove the illegals?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I mean, you know, as I said, I lived in Albany, New York, and I ran for city council president. I ran for office 3 different times. And I finally got elected after 12 years to become city council president myself. My mother pointed out that I could have gotten an MD and a law degree in the time that it took me to get elected to the presidency of the Albany City Council. But the fact I was going to point out was that even in Albany, which was a city of only, maybe 100,000 people, which is big by some categories, I guess, by some standards. But one time I was undergraduate dean at the time at the State University of New York, and I was standing in the cafeteria talking to 2 of our undergraduates. One was from downstate, what we call downstate New York, near New York City, Long Island, etc. And one was from a little town outside of Albany. And I said, how do you like living in New York? Because here they were on the big campus of the State University of New York. We had 22,000 students. And at one and the same time, one of them said it's too small, and the other one said it's too big, right? So you have that divergence, if you would, among various sectors of your population. It's there forever. Either they've come to a big city, a quote, big city in New York, and they think that this is a growth city, and their fortunes are going to grow with it, or else they feel that they've been left by the wayside by the processes that are not going as well in that city as they had hoped and they had thought, and maybe they have to move on.
Phyllis Friedel writes, since census forms go to addresses, how are homeless people counted?
Excellent question. They're literally counted by people going, you know, 1 foot in front of the other, usually late at night if necessary, around the parks. I remember in Albany, as I was saying, this bright young assemblyman who was put in charge of the census process in Albany, New York, and he literally walked the streets. He walked the streets of the city, the downtown part of Albany, New York. Now, Albany is the capital city. That means at night, after 5 or 6, 8 o'clock at night, nobody's on the streets. But there were a lot of park benches. There were a lot of benches along the sidewalks, and usually on top of the bench or under the bench, covered by some kind of maybe mattresses made out of newspaper, was a person who didn't have a home. And this assemblyman counted every single one of those that he could find by walking the streets of Albany night after night after night. And picture that being repeated in every park, in every city, in every downtown, of every suburb in the United States. That's how determined the people of the Census Bureau are to fulfill their constitutional mandate.
Penny Pickett writes, mainly a comment, there has also been some discussion during the pandemic of urban and suburban residents looking at relocating to rural and currently underpopulated areas. We'll see if that actually happens.
Yeah, yeah. You know, again, it's that circular nature, the feedback loop of American politics and American population policy, American population dynamics. People want to move where they think there's some activity, they think there are some economic prospects. They save and they save and they save and they get their whole family bus tickets or whatever. You see them on TV being interviewed all the time here. And then they come up and 5 years later, they're not any better employed than they were in their old town. And the whole family begins to grouse about it, begins to complain. Maybe we should go back to where we used to live. Maybe we should move to a smaller city. Maybe we should assume that the Republicans don't have control, for example, of as many suburbs as they used to. Maybe our prospects will be better some other place. And what the danger is, time is a very important, very critical factor in the census and in politics, right? Timing is everything. So if you're having this argument about the census and development and momentum and economic prosperity, at the same time that certain cities are changing political parties, are becoming maybe passe, the young people in that city aren't getting involved in politics. They aren't running for re-election if they've already had one term. Then you find out that maybe the dynamics are different and you need to move on. And the United States is one of the most mobile countries in the world. I mean, people find it fascinating. If they ask us, where were you born and how many cities have you lived in your lifetime? And I would say, what would I say? I would say 12. 12? All my relatives, my mother's relatives that live in Lebanon, they've only lived in 2 places, right? And my father's relatives who came down from French Canada, they maybe lived in 3 or 4 different places, but not 12, not 12. So on the one hand, we are among the most blessed of people in the sense that we have so many opportunities, so many places we can go down to the bus station and buy a ticket to travel to. But on the other hand, this is a particularly difficult time in American history, difficult time in the American economic growth picture. And we're really not sure at all how that's going to turn out. So a young person coming to Alexandria, Virginia, waiting at the bus station, which bus is that person going to get on? It's a very interesting question. I have 2 young grandchildren. One's 16, one's 14. The 16-year-old obviously is going into his senior year. He may not, in the Fairfax school system, first of all, he may not have a senior year. They just announced today. And I've been fascinated by the politics of what's happening as senior political leaders have to deal with this enormous crisis that's out there. They just told him, we just found out last week that my grandsons only had 2 choices. One was to go to online school and one was to come to real school, what I call real school. But the superintendent changed his mind today. He changed his mind because the releasing of data, of new realities about this virus is so intense and so extensive and so all pervasive that even the best intentioned of leaders with school boards behind them and a million people with computers and whatever, they can't keep up. They have to change their minds, change their stated policy conclusions, which they just arrived at last week, and tell us, okay, your children are not going to be going to school in physical terms at all in the fall semester. Look us up in the spring. That's basically what's happening. It's an amazing time. I mean, my son is grown, but his sons are not. And I said to him the other day, I don't know what I would do, honey, if I were their parent. You know, what would I want to happen with my own children? And he looked, my son and his wife were really stricken as they tried to figure out how to adapt to this great new sense of reality that's out there, and a very confusing sense of that. So it's a challenging time. It's a tough time. And, you know, I'm glad that my grandsons have had a good education. They believe in the United States of America. They're not sure which direction it's going in and where they're going. But they believe that the prospects are still good for them. Now, have we made that message available? Have we made it clear to as many people in the country as possible? I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of people who aren't really sure what their place is going to be in 2020, 2030, 2040 America.
Okay. William Taylor writes, how would you make better use of the vast amount of data gathered in the census?
Oh my goodness. You know, it's an interesting question, and I'm laughing because I'm thinking of some of the volunteer projects that I've been involved in, but some of them involve data analysis. I mean, there are sometimes when a whole community will put up on a bulletin board, an electronic bulletin board, the fact that they have a new data set, and they could make it available to people to help them. They don't have the personnel to analyze them. They need help. They need people to come in. It used to be in the old days, you would come in with your tie clip, you know, that had a slide rule on it, and hope for the best, right? Well, now you're inviting young people graduating from college, hopefully at a volunteer capacity, to come in and help you analyze as much of this data as possible. It's a almost a Dodge City time in American politics, I think. That the prospects are wide open at a time when people's consciousness and their sense of place is not. And that's where the controversy is coming in.
There's a hand raised in the participants panel. Go ahead, Mr. Meyer.
It's good to see you again, Dr. Desfosses.
Hey, nice to see you.
Forward to your analysis of the election, post-election. Unfortunately, I would really like to get you back 3 or 4 weeks before the election to give us some insights. But apart from that, the census has a lot to do with enumeration and allocation. That is, how many people are there in the country, but how many representatives can they duly send to Washington? And within that context, those people are going to be responsible for allocating resources and funneling mostly money back to the states. But is there any use of the census data by the states themselves to change their own policies or create new policies?
I'm absolutely sure that there is, John. I mean, it's too valuable a resource. It's not going to just stay quietly on the library shelf, you know. It's too valuable a resource. It could be valuable to your Chamber of Commerce, to your young entrepreneurial class, to your scholars at the university. I think there's just a treasure trove out there. And there has been a lot of volunteerism, by the way, in data analysis. A lot of cities will sometimes, as I said, ask for volunteers to come in and help with the data sets that they have. I'm not sure I saw any of this yet on behalf of the Census Bureau, but it is a fascinating idea that, you know, we have buildings and buildings and buildings worth of data, and we're looking for bright young people to come in and help analyze it. In a way, they are, and they're hiring here and there, but certainly not. They're not getting the funding that the Census Bureau feels they deserve and feels that they need to have in order to do these data justice.
Doreen Sanborn writes, question one, I don't understand. Without a citizenship question, how do we know who is undocumented? And two, wasn't there a citizenship question on previous, much older census forms?
Yes, there was from time to time, but it was not, as I understand it, there's not been a level of comfort about that question. It's a difficult question, right? It says it's not your status as an individual that counts to us. It's your status as a citizen that counts. Well, what if I'm not a citizen? Does that mean I don't count? Well, I'm glad you asked that, because in fact, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. So the politics around this have been particularly harried, I think, and particularly politicized. And that's a word I've been seeing about the census in the papers the last couple of weeks. The New York Times has run several different articles about the census data, and not only the impact of the virus on whether enough people are available to do the counting, et cetera, of all these people and all these streets and whatever, but of whether, in the case of New York City, whether the rich people are staying home in New York so they can be counted. It turns out they're not staying home. They're bailing on the city of New York to go to their country houses where they think they're going to be safer from the marauding nature of this virus. And the census people, therefore, feel really bereft, because it's the wealthier people, obviously, who can afford to get out and who can figure out how to do it at a time of maximum medical and biological distress. And it's those people who aren't going to be counted as part of your own population because they fled the city to go to the safety of their country home. So it's interesting, I was a Russian major in college, and I read a lot of Tolstoy. And Tolstoy, there were always those big mansions in Russia in the 1800s, in little cities, but they all faced the street. You didn't know what was going on behind the facade. Everyone looked as elegant as could possibly be. But behind the facades of those houses were incredible political and economic and geographical intrigues and religious intrigues going on. So I think we have a pretty good taste of that. What I read about from the movies that are coming out, there's a lot of that's a theme in the movies right now. That is a time of opportunity, but it's a time of danger. And I don't want to end on that note, because I'm not a pessimist. I'm really not. I feel that this country has amazing prospects and amazing people and a sense of tradition and values that are so important and so ingrained in such a large proportion of our population, that I think we're always going to right ourselves. I mean, maybe we'll wobble off the tracks here, wobble off the tracks there, but I think we right ourselves eventually with a little pushing and shoving by the politicians of the day. And there's a lot of that pushing and shoving that's going on in 2020, you can be sure of that.
Author Lerner writes, are prisoners counted? If so, are they counted in the states where they are imprisoned or in their hometowns?
I'm not sure. As I recall I'm trying to think, as I recall from living in Albany so long, they were counted in the towns in which the prisons were located. And that's why the prisons in upstate New York were welcomed by the population. A lot of the towns in upstate New York had nothing, no factories, no anything, but they had a prison. And the reason they were willing to take the prison from the gifted hands of development people in the Office of Corrections was that those people would be counted as part of their own population. That's what I remember from living in upstate New York. But I don't know how widely that's done. But I'll find out.
There's a hand raised. David Hensfeld, go ahead, please.
Yes, Mike, for your purposes, this will supersede what I wrote in the Q&A. It's more a comment than a question, but from what I know and what I'm reading, it's pretty clear under the 14th Amendment that Trump has no right to exclude undocumented aliens from the census and no right to keep them out of the apportionment for Congress. The 14th Amendment provides representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So the only persons he's allowed to exclude from a census and from the congressional apportions are Indians. So I don't know what his basis for claiming he has a right to do this is. Speaker Pelosi has said it's clearly unconstitutional.
Yeah, you know, the trouble right now, David, is that a lot of people are prepared to go to the mat, shall we say, for some of these things that they believe in. And the president is in that frame of mind. I mean, whether you agree with him or not, he is ready to go to the mat for some of these things. The people that he wants counted or people that he doesn't want counted. And he's maintained that posture since, as I said, the first day he was nominated. And he's not giving it up. He's just not going to give it up. So I think he will have had an enormous impact, not only on the social relations, if you would, among groups of our population, but on the demography, on the study of population among these groups as well. We haven't heard the end of President Trump yet, and we may not hear it for many years to come.
Jim Coyle writes, what efforts are made before the mail-outs to get all newer addresses, i.e. the database of residences?
Say it again, I'm sorry, what?
What efforts are made to before the mail-out to get all newer addresses, i.e. the database of residences, not new construction homes and all?
Incredible efforts are made to do that. And the towns, you know, the towns and the localities and the counties and all those levels of government have a big stake in making sure that that happens. I mean, if I were county exec in upstate New York County, I would want to make sure that every single person in my county was counted. And therefore, I would want to help them out in finding out where those new housing developments were and how many houses there were and how many schools had been erected to take care of the children in there. And that issue of counting the children has become a very, very important one. You'll hear it discussed a lot about in the context of the virus, whether the children are carriers or not, whether they're dangerous even if they don't know, they don't show any illness themselves. But in the case of population policy and census studies, young people, I mean, that's the coin of the realm, right? That's the most important thing you have in your society. If you have a lot of kids in your schools and they're being built by, you know, outside of every development that's going up in every corner of your county or your town, you are golden. You are golden because children are the future. I mean, it sounds corny. Carl Sandburg said a baby is God's proof that the world should go on. Well, a baby is also a census taker's delight because the world is going on and people need to be counted and people need to be seen as the resources for the future that they are.
Shelley Gersten makes a comment. I know that the military uses census data in their recruitment strategies.
Uses census data in their recruitment strategies?
That's correct.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, you'd be crazy not to. Those data are out there. For example, you know, say in the case of my father grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, a mill town in the western part of Massachusetts. And during the Depression, they had nothing to eat. His family had nothing to eat. So my father and one of his friends rode the rails into Canada looking for a job. Then they came back, and fortunately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been elected president. And he built these things called CCC camps, Citizen Conservation Corps camps. And my dad got a job in one of them, you know, kind of chopping wood or clearing roads out in the countryside for new development. And that was the only way that his family ate. His mother, his father, his brothers and sisters. My father was the only one old enough to get a job and the only one who could ride the rails to Canada and back and found a job. And then he found basically a job in a government subsidized activity. And that's why there's a big argument about that right now. How much should the government get involved in giving these checks, these support checks, to people who've recently lost their jobs because of the virus? And how much should the government actually get involved in maybe taking an FDR type approach? All of that is being argued now, and it's being argued in an election year. So you know we're going to see the echoes of that for many months and years to come.
Jim Coyle has a hand raised. Would you unmute, sir?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, okay. In regards to the question about the citizenship question, I thought the train had passed on that already, and the citizenship question was not added to the questionnaire that was at least sent out, and that the president had directed that other means would be used to identify undocumented people.
That's exactly right. And so today, for some reason today, on the noon news, the president's people were announcing a new wording of that, a wording that they couldn't get through. They didn't get through with the initial wording. The Supreme Court rejected that, said that that was not constitutional in their minds. But the president's been, and his people have been working on different wording of that question to try to get by the Supreme Court. And as of this noontime, they thought they had found it. Now, I didn't get a chance before I came on the air to talk to all of you today to go and find out, if I could, what that new wording was. I just heard the announcers on Channel 4, you know, going rah, 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 and people clapping and hollering and yelling and whatever. But it's clear that the president continues to try to figure out what's going to be the golden key here, what's going to open the resources that he wants to see open and close the resources that he wants to see closed. He's going to do it. He's determined. He's trying every key that's in the White House in that key vault in the back of the building. You know, the White House has something like 140 rooms. So there's a lot of machinations that are possible, and a lot of meetings that are possible. And he's around a lot of weekends by himself. So he's meeting with his people, and he's clearly got the census in mind, and he's got the immigration, what he calls the immigration problem, very much in mind. It's bothered him, it's obsessed him since the day he was nominated. So stay tuned.
Noah Engelberg writes, what legal challenges have been made in the past to conduct and to the conduct and results of census? What legal challenges do you anticipate being made to this census?
Oh, whatever's possible out there, somebody will do. You know, I mean, I'm no longer surprised by the litigiousness of American population groups, be they activist groups, be they ethnic groups, be they, for example, Chicago has a group of undercounted disability adults. There's some long name that they have, but they're all adults, they're all disabled, and they feel that they're not being adequately counted. And they have formed an activist group with, you know, a president and vice president and dues and all kinds of things. and they're meeting and they're organizing and they're going to press their case. The next, in terms of the census, right now we are such a free society. I had a South African representative come to one of my classes at State University of New York at Albany before apartheid ended. Apartheid meant the separation of races and that blacks could not vote, blacks could not own property, blacks could not get any kind of a good job. Blacks had no rights. And he looked at my class. Now, the State University of New York at Albany, these were usually a lot of first generation college students, but their families were pretty prosperous. And he looked at this class and he said, in my country, we are dying for the vote, dying for the vote. And in your country, you throw it away. True, true. So, I mean, the vote is one of the most precious forms of currency that we have. When I ran for a political office, I was dean of undergraduate studies at SUNY. And I thought, I knew 15,000 students, for God's sakes. And I thought, boy, I'll be a shoo-in. I didn't win. And the reason I didn't win is because undergraduate students at a university, a public university, don't feel that town belongs to them, that political system has any value to them whatsoever, and they didn't come out and vote. So the next time I ran, I didn't pay any attention to the students on my own campus. I went to every single neighborhood around the campus and organized all those people instead. So, I mean, politics finds its own level. It's like water, it permeates, it finds out where there's movement, where there's possibilities, where there's no blockage, where they can kind of sneak through. And even though I was considered, my opponent classified me as a refugee. He said Helen Desfosses doesn't even belong here. She's a refugee from Maine. I mean, that just cracked me up. To be a refugee from Maine was really quite a designation. But in his own way, he was correct. His family had lived in upstate New York for several centuries. And here I was, a carpetbagger who just came up in 1978 to take a job at the SUNY Albany as undergraduate dean. And he didn't think that was right. And he didn't think I should have any kind of political support. So he called me a carpetbagger and a refugee. So, those were the most loaded terms he could possibly think of. And right now in America, we're kind of fixated, I think, in almost not necessarily a dangerous way, but in a highly electrified way. We're focused on the questions of identity and who belongs and who deserves to belong. And that's what the big fights are about in America today.
Nancy Jamila writes, are foreign citizens associated with the various embassies counted?
Associated with the various embassies, that again, I don't know. I have to check up on that. That's that same category of questions. I'll get back to Mike and Michael, figure out how to get the information to you, because it's a fascinating question in and of itself. Not only who decides who gets counted, who decides who gets counted, and who does the counting, and what's happening to the data of all of those door-to-door visits and midnight park visits and all that stuff. I mean, the data is precious. It's absolutely precious, right? I'm sure Procter & Gamble, everybody would love to get their hands on these data because they're fresh and they give us a picture of what's happening in every town in this country, to young people, to people of different races, different nationalities. Who wins and who loses is a classic question in American politics.
Susan Van Hemel writes, the U.S. government estimates as of 2019 approximately 35 million legal non-citizen residents in the United States.
Yeah. 35 million legal non-citizen residents of the United States. That's a heck of a big category of people. And there are fights about that. why should there be 35 million in that category when we need space? People will say we need more fresh air, we need more green space, we need more jobs available to us. Why should we have all those people here? Why are we even making them feel comfortable by including them in our censuses? You know, we should be isolating those people. We should be driving them out. There's all those arguments that are held every 10 years or every 20 years. They keep surfacing, not only in the United States of America, but in most countries of the world. Population is considered one of your greatest resources, but you want them to be, you meaning the elite, you want them to be of the categories of people that you prefer, you know, that you either identify with or feel ought to be rewarded or whatever. And that's why you see these arguments going on about immigrants and non-people, aliens, people without identity papers. Why should they think they deserve to be welcomed in the towns and counties of the United States of America? So that's one of the sub-themes that's out there very, very strongly. I grew up on the coast of Maine, and we used to go to the beach. You know, that's what you did in the summer. And there were all kinds of little waves, you know, and you go, ooh, it's freezing. The water is freezing in Maine. I don't know why we ever went in it, but we did. And all the waves would be coming. But meanwhile, sometimes there would be these huge waves that were forming, meanwhile, underneath the water, you know. And every 40, 50 waves, a huge one would come and just knock you right over. And that happens in politics, too. That we're focusing on a lot of little waves. There's a lot of little noises now going on in America. But meanwhile, while we're organizing, while we're listening to me talking here today, and I'm listening to your questions here today, somewhere, maybe a mile away, there are 140 people who are doing something totally opposite to what we're doing. Maybe they're having a meeting, maybe it's the John Birch Society, and they're having a meeting on how to get rid of all these people that we don't feel belong in our country. That's America, right? That's America. That's why we say it's important for people to vote, for people to register to vote, for people to make sure that other people are registered. That's the coin of the realm. If you're not voting, you don't have a say. And every 4 years, you've got to have a vote. You got to have a say, and that's where we are again in 2020.
Linda Gordon makes two comments. One, the Census Bureau works closely with the U.S. Postal Service to keep addresses up to date, and also that embassy personnel are not counted in the U.S. Census. Dennis,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, when you think of the Postal Service, I mean, they form an incredible army, if you would, of workers whose activities are very important to the census, because every single one of those letters that comes back, not at this address, died, deceased, whatever the people stamp on these letters, those letters are like gold. They are like gold. I was stunned when I was running for office in Albany, New York, how much turnover there was in the residents of every street in the capital city. In 10 years, some streets turned over completely. People, the amount of divorce and mobility and graduation and everything that was going on was stupefying. I had no idea. You know, so I got a sense of a political landscape that may be still on the surface, but underneath is not only churning, but it's engulfing underneath. And every 4 years in our country, we have a big opportunity to see what's really been going on underneath those little waves all this time. And that's what we're seeing.
Time for the last question. The Honest Census Communications Act was introduced in Congress, but never passed. Has there been any recent push to get this bill through Congress? It has severe penalties for those who spread false information about the 2020 census.
Yeah, yeah. There have been some efforts, but I must say, people like Rand Paul, there are people in our Congress, in our Senate, who hold certain beliefs so strongly that you're not going to budge them no matter what, no matter what. And I'm not saying that he necessarily has a position on this particular issue, but I bet he does. I bet he does. And he shows absolutely no shyness about expressing his views on that particular issue and on making sure that his views are powerful enough to carry the day. And that's what a lot of American politics is populated with. People who think that their views ought to carry the day.